In this segment, we'll take a look at interpreting labor market models, including thinking about how changes in supply or changes in demand will affect different markets. And we'll do this as part of the continuation of evaluating labor market models module. So let's take a look at a basic labor market model. We've seen this market before. In fact, we've even applied some numbers to it in prior segments in this module, where we have a normally shaped labor supply curve, so an upward sloping labor supply curve, a downward sloping labor demand curve, and we have some L star that's in positive space, so a positive number of workers at equilibrium, and W star, which again has a positive value at equilibrium. In this case, we have to think about what's taking place with the labor supply curve here that's causing it to cross the wage or y-axis in positive space or a positive value. When we see this, what we're really seeing is a reservation wage. And a reservation wage is a wage at or above which workers will begin to supply labor, but at or below which workers will supply no labor. So in this case, let's call this W prime. Then at W prime, no one is prepared to work in this market, but at anything above W prime, workers will begin to present themselves for service and based upon the needs of the firm. Well, what happens in this case, or in this type of market, when labor demand changes? Well, when labor demand itself changes, we would see a movement outward or inward of the labor demand curve. Let's assume the labor demand increased, such that we went from LD to LD prime. Well, of course, this would then cause a change in the equilibrium wage and in the equilibrium level of labor. Such that W star rose and L star also rose. You can see then that we've said that labor demand has increased here, which really means that the quantity of labor required at any given wage has gone up. And so it's a movement out and to the right. We call that an increase, or we say that's gone up. A movement in and to the left would be a decrease. Well, think about that similarly with labor supply. Let's assume for a moment that labor supply decreased. Labor supply decreasing wouldn't mean that the curve would shift downward. That actually, if we shifted it downward, that would be a movement along this lines, which would be out and to the right, which would actually increase the number of labor units. So if we think about labor supply decreasing, we actually think about it coming inward in such a fashion that the number of workers required at that wage, we'll call this L prime. That wage, in fact, we'll call L prime prime, double prime. That would then yield a wage increase at W prime prime. Anything that causes simply a shift along the curve would have to be a function of either L or W. So along either the supply curve or along the demand curve would simply be a change in wage or labor. Any other change in the marketplace that's going to affect workers will cause a shift of these curves. So wage or labor changing will simply cause the movements along these various curves, but when we have something or anything else that changes in the labor market, that's going to cause a shift of the curves. Well, let's look at a slightly different version here where we don't have a labor supply intersecting the y-axis in positive space, where we actually would have it intersecting the y-axis in negative space, or in other words, we see the labor supply intersects the x or labor axis. Well, what does this mean? Well, this means that some positive number of workers, we'll call it L prime, is willing to work at a zero wage. Well, that might sound nonsensical to us, but maybe not. Maybe that would be some number of workers present themselves for a benefit other than wage. Maybe this is some volunteerism. Maybe this is patriotism. Maybe this is just people that gain some value from working that isn't encompassed by the wage. Maybe it's status. Maybe it's prestige. But we clearly have some positive number of workers willing to supply their labor at a positive or at a zero wage, and above that number of workers, then they actually do want to start to get paid. So in that case, the reservation wage may be zero or less, which seems somewhat nonsensical, but in fact, there may be other motivators, other satisfiers that cause one to work that aren't encompassed by the wage. Let's look at a slightly different version of this that maybe goes towards this volunteerism issue. If we think about a positive equilibrium value for labor, but at a negative wage. So this is market clearing, the normally shaped labor supply, normally shaped labor demand curve and or equations, but where we have a positive labor required at equilibrium, so the market clears at a positive level of labor, but at a negative wage. Well, I would think that this would absolutely be some sort of volunteerism. Think about volunteers. They oftentimes will travel great distances to apply their labor. Maybe they're doing some volunteer service in a foreign country, or perhaps they need to buy different pieces of equipment or clothing to be able to provide their services, but they're not getting paid anything for it. Or maybe the actual cost of travel, cost of applying their services is actually greater than the real wage they receive, and so we might think about this in this kind of a form. Let's look at yet another, or think about yet another here. And this is where we might have a normally sloped labor supply and demand curve, but that yields some positive wage and negative level of labor. Well, what might this be? Well, if we think about it, this would have to be a type of worker that the firm or the market is willing to pay to stay away. So we want some number of workers to leave the marketplace in order for us to have a regularly functioning market, and but at a positive wage. Maybe this is the firm that is offering a incentive program for some of their older, more experienced workers to retire early. So they're willing to pay them something to get rid of some of the workers in their workplace, a reduction in force program. Maybe we can think about this a little bit differently. Could this be some kind of a worker that we just don't want to see in the workplace? Could this be a very low-skilled worker that we don't want to see in the workplace, but that firms end up paying not a direct wage to, but firms pay taxes that go into the social coffers, the state and federal coffers, that then might be used to pay some either disability premium or maybe some welfare or something that workers with very low skill sets might apply to. So we can think about these in different ways, and I think it's important for us to consider what different shapes, what different forms might mean. Let's think about yet another. This would be a labor supply curve that's perfectly horizontal, but facing a normal labor demand curve. Well, this might be simply not us seeing the market for an entire type of worker in a large marketplace, but this might be thinking about this from the standpoint of the firm, because at W star, then in this market of, let's say it's moderately skilled workers, this firm can hire whatever number of moderately skilled workers it wants at that wage, such that if the labor demand curve shift out and to the right, to LD prime, it would yield a higher number of employed workers at L prime, but at the same wage. This would be indicative of a firm which would be a price taker or would not be a wage setter, would not be a price setter, a price taker in the marketplace that is at whatever the required wage is going to find a nearly unlimited quantity of available workers, and if they do increase their demand for workers, it's not going to increase the wage. This would probably be a relatively normal situation, but not for the entire market, but more likely for a firm within a market. We go a little bit further here, then this is going to be where we see a normally shaped labor supply curve and yet a perfectly horizontal labor demand curve. Well, what would this mean? This would mean that at W star, firms are willing to employ as many workers as present themselves. So if labor supply, say, moved out and to the right, so we saw an increase in labor supply to LS prime, well, the firms are happy to employ them, and they will then still pay W star and to get more workers. Well, what happens if the wage that these workers in this supply relationship want, what happens if that wage increases, say, to W prime? Well, in this case, if the demand curve is here at W star, and if the workers required W prime, then there are literally no workers demanded. So this might be then a labor demand curve for a type of worker for which there are many substitutes, where I could, if the wage increased and I'm the firm, I'm the employer, if the wage required by the worker increases, then I would say, no, I no longer need that type of worker. I would rather employ some other type of worker that would be a perfect substitute for this. Or maybe this is a market where we see that at W star, firms are willing to employ human labor, but anything above W star, firms now might be motivated to transition from human labor to, say, mechanical or technological labor, robotics, remove the worker as a human being from the process and replace it with capital. And as we consider yet one more, perhaps, this would be where we have a normally sloped labor supply curve, but a labor demand curve that's perfectly vertical. Well, what might this represent? Well, in commonly thinking about this, regardless of what happens to labor supply, if it comes out and to the right, or if it shifted in and to the left, as I've shown here, then the number of workers required by firms in this market hasn't changed, but we see that the wages have either increased or perhaps have then decreased. The equilibrium or market clearing wages have either increased or decreased. Well, what does this suggest? This is a type of worker for which there are virtually no substitutes. If the marketplace needs this number of this type of worker, regardless of what it might need to pay them.